Margaret, right now the discourse in DC around China and Latin America is oftentimes about U.S.-China competition, and it's not just Latin America; it's also how we frame Africa, usually like U.S. policy and China policy on Africa as well as Southeast Asia. So I'm just wondering how you, in your research, how you try and go deeper, and when you talk with policymakers here in Washington, how do you try and impress on them a more nuanced look at Latin America, not just viewing through the lens of China? And I do feel that there's an underscoring now in this administration of that rivalry because of their focus on the Western Hemisphere and what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question, and I would go so far as to say that it's not just a focus on looking at this through the lens of U.S.-China competition, but also really focusing on specifically and almost exclusively on those developments in Latin America, China-Latin American context that have potential national security implications for the United States in the event of a potential conflict, right, between the U.S. and China. So when you look at the reporting, I mean, this includes journalistic and academic. We're looking at case studies in particular. So much of the focus is on those projects that are deemed to or viewed to have a potential dual use capacity, right, civilian military capacity. So we've heard a lot about Shanghai, the Shanghai port, right, which is a massive port. China has majority ownership and control in many forms of that port in Peru, and it is deemed to be or considered to be, broadly speaking, among the policy community here in the U.S., something that could be leveraged to China's benefit in the event of a future conflict. The other areas of focus tend to be other sort of, primarily maritime transport infrastructure, such as the Panama Canal, but other canal-related and infrastructure projects that are also of concern for the same reasons. Surveillance capabilities, right, whether they be space-related or at the local level, but that would again introduce vulnerabilities for the U.S. military or others in the event of a conflict. And so this is, my concern is that not just that this is being viewed right through a primarily U.S.-China lens, but that it's only part of the story, right? I mean, if you're talking about U.S.-China competition, it goes further than that. Where so much of what's happening, right, is in the digital space. It's in massive investment across what China has called new infrastructure, right? These innovation-related industries, and we're seeing extensive growth in those areas. I wouldn't call it dominance, right, across the board, but certainly a very competitive position for Chinese companies across countries and across sectors. And so, that story in many cases is not one that we're hearing about in much depth. And so, I think what I try to impress upon those who are thinking about this in from a strategic dimension here in Washington is that the story is bigger, and not just that it's bigger, but it's ever evolving, right? It's continuously evolving. There are all kinds of actors and factors that are shaping this, right? Both in China, if we think about Chinese policy and the challenges that China is facing and the implications of the policy making that China is introducing. The U.S. has a role to play in this too, as we know, and we've seen some efforts, and we'll likely see more efforts, right, to engage in this space in an effort to shape outcomes. But also important to this is the Latin America story, and that's one that tends to be left out, I think, almost entirely, right? This is a co-produced relationship, right? China, of course, has interests, right? It has some policies that are governing the ways in which Chinese companies are engaging in different sectors across the region and the mechanisms through which they do that. But so many of the outcomes are driven by Latin American actors, and in ways that many may not anticipate, right? Things can go completely sideways for a lot of different reasons, to be they political in nature because of the reactions of NGOs and the effectiveness of their efforts in derailing certain projects, because projects fall out of favor, things go terribly wrong in the construction process. Really, you name it. And so that story too is one that's really missing and one that needs to be understood and that I try to press on my students, but also, you know, when making or having these conversations with policy level.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Margaret. So, can you give us an example, one or two examples of like a thing that we're missing in Latin America or that's missing from the discourse right now on the China-Latin America relationship? If you have a specific country or specific type of interaction country to tell us about, that'd be great.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think there are a few things that we need to. Perhaps there are some assumptions, right, that are being made. And I don't know, I mean, that the story is always missing, but sometimes the assumptions are taken for granted, right? Or they are, at least in the policymaking space, one comes across, you know, some of the same narratives over and over, even though, as I mentioned, this is an evolving dynamic, right? And things may be changing in the moment, more or less. One is, you know, what China wants out of this relationship, and that certainly is something that has changed over time. There's a degree of continuity, there's a degree of, you know, resource-seeking activity, market-seeking activity, an effort to make Chinese companies, you know, competitive across domains and across sectors. But beyond that, now we see a wide-ranging new policies being implemented in China that have implications for Latin America and the way in which companies will engage or not engage, as the case may be. And in the past year or two, Latin America has been somewhat deprioritized, at least from an investment perspective and in comparison to other regions. Another, I think, really important question that we need to ask is the extent to which the US itself and its interest in competing with the US is driving what China is doing. Right? There's an assumption, I think, here in Washington, that this is a big part of the equation. It may be in certain instances, in certain countries, and in certain, you know, certain types of engagement, but it's perhaps not the driving factor, right, for so much of what is happening across the global South and indeed in the Latin American context. You know, another, I think, critical story that we need to cover is this question of and understanding more depth are these questions of lessons learned, right? How is China evolving based on what it's learned about what it should do and not do, right, in pursuit of certain objectives, be they commercial or political in nature or otherwise, and about shifting perceptions in Latin America of what it is to work with China, how best to achieve certain objectives. Certainly, you know, the Ecuador of Rafael Correa is not the Ecuador of today, and the way in which Ecuador is engaging with China is very different based on the experiences had about 10 years ago. And the same can be said, I think, in other countries where they're beginning to see the effects of recent policy decisions in China, economic policy decisions, and in some cases are describing what they're feeling as an inundación, right, as a flooding or of activity. So some don't go so far as to call it dumping, but a lot of this excess capacity, right, the effects of Chinese policy are being felt in the global South and in specific countries in particular in ways that are very worrisome and may very well change the nature, dynamic, tenor of these relationships in the years to come. So, I mean, it's not as though we're not getting it right necessarily, or you know, but it's a lot of these stories just aren't being explored or told, I think, in enough depth to demonstrate the extent, the dimension, right, and the depth of this relationship and how it is indeed one that is ever evolving.
And Jim, you talked about how your exposure from China then led you to have to report on China from the outside, and you said very specifically that a lot of the conversation, at least in the US, is now dominated by what policymakers say here in Washington. And so I think for both of our newspapers, a lot of the stories that we end up doing are framed through that discourse. How do you grapple with that, having been someone who's recently reporting China? And then when you choose stories or when you approach stories here based in the US, how do you try and navigate around or into the conversation of US-China policy?
I mean, I think it's a really good question. As you know, the story is so much a G2 issue, whether it's in Latin America. I mean, I think that what Margaret's saying is exactly right, that we're not really listening to, you know, why Peru might want to have the Shanghai port. in the same way that we're thinking about it in the dimension of U.S.-China relations. And the U.S. government, it clearly, always the question is what is the administration's China strategy? And it's never really very clear, right? It's almost a full-time job is trying to figure out what the administration's China policy is. And that's everyone, that's each administration. And but we have voices in China, the creation of the Select Committee on China, for instance, it's supposed to be a clearinghouse for ideas on China. And I'm not sure that every voice in Washington is super informed about China. I think that many politicians are proudly, proud to say, I've never been to China and I never will go to China. And in one of the arguments that they would make is, I could be an expert on Iran and North Korea and never go to those countries. I think that's missing a lot of the story. In terms of trying to understand, trying to interpret what a policy might be from Washington and try to understand who the players are and why they'd be saying certain things, that's an ongoing job. One of my British newspaper friends would always say that their question is always, why is this liar lying to me? And that's sort of the starting point for reporting, which I think is a sort of good rule to sort of keep in the back of your mind. As I'm not in China and dealing much more with Washington, there's so many fascinating ideas that are coming out of this city in terms of expertise. And some of those are from politicians, a lot of them are from think tanks, but I don't know, you almost have to pick your battles. What is it that I'm going to focus on? And then you just try to talk to lots of people and try to build a certain story. But I'm going to agree with Margaret again. I think it very often just becomes this, what is the rivalry between the US and China and how this issue or that issue is seen through that rivalry. But the business is incredibly complex. I mean, how many people were reporting about NVIDIA 5 years ago, or could even spell it or knew what it was? It's so technical, whether you're dealing with China from the automotive sector or the human rights or technology like NVIDIA. It's so technical that I think you have to look more and more, not for the noise, not for the flashy lights or the great quote, that you really have to dig a little bit harder to try to understand what's the complexity here.
I want to follow up and ask you a structural question about the newsroom, because I know that, when reporters from the Journal were expelled from China, then you created these satellite newsrooms around the world, and also because people were rotating out of China. So I know in Washington you had a team of China specialists and that team has ended now. And then you're in New York, and there's also a team of China specialists in New York. So do you all divide up your beats so that, for example, someone from your team is supposed to focus on China's interaction with the US, and you have more latitude, for example, to choose different topics on reporting on China out in the world? Or how does it work beat by beat, and especially following the elimination of the Washington team? And now it's just the New York team, I think.
The sausage making is never very pretty.
But as a journalist, I know the structure is very important for what stories end up getting reported. So that's why I asked you that question.
It's really story by story, and we're figuring it out all the time. We've had many management changes at the Wall Street Journal and structural changes. I think that increasingly they're trying to put more of the power for the story in Singapore, which is becoming our base. We have fewer people in Hong Kong. We still have people in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore. And we have a few people. We have 3 foreigners in China itself, mainland China, in Beijing. We do work collaboratively. So there's a certain amount of freelancing, but it's in many ways, mean, it's both top down and bottom up in terms of the way we report. We don't have one particular system in terms of how we break it up, but we try to be involved in stories that are going to be touching on China, and that's increasingly everything. And I think that and that doesn't always work out. Sometimes it's news to the bureau chief in Beijing that somebody's writing something about China. We do have a team in New York, Ling Wei and me, and we work together, but we sort of work separately. I mean, we're not a great answer because each topic is different, but we are trying to centralize it more from Singapore.
Great, thanks. And Shawn, has your story published yet?
Just went out.
Okay, I'm wondering if our editors will call, like Jim's editor and my editor will call us to on the story, but
I hope so.
right. So your entire beat is right now firmly immersed in U.S.-China relations because we're reporting on terrorists, we're reporting on the trade relationship, which is for President Trump the central aspect of the U.S.-China relationship. So how do you approach that beat? And it's very different than in the Biden administration. How has the change in administrations changed the way you approach reporting on U.S.-China?
Yeah, and it's very different from the first Trump administration as well, which I think is an important point as well. Look, I don't know that there is a China strategy right now. I think and trying to figure out what it is and who is driving it is one of the key questions. The story we just published is that the Chinese, going into the Madrid talks, offered a big surge of Chinese investment into the U.S. economy in return for a lifting of curbs or loosening of curbs on inbound Chinese investment. We don't know yet if President Trump would accept that, but we're talking probably about trillions of dollars in terms of the size of the offer. And we know that President Trump, and this is a change from his first term, has really made inbound investment and attracting inbound investment a pillar. He's talked about $17 trillion in investment coming into the United States, which is, if you know the size of the U.S. economy, it's about $29-30 trillion economy. Seems improbable, at least in a short period. But we are in this world right now where, as we were discussing this story, where it's like, well, this is a complete red line. The last 10 years, the policy in the United States has been to restrain Chinese investment, to harden up the CFIUS constraints. As recently as February, the Trump administration was putting out an America First investment policy document in which they were talking about China as a strategic rival and really taking a hard line towards any Chinese investment in the United States and applying greater scrutiny of it. Well, the guy who wrote that memo has since left the administration, was turfed out. And we are in this world now where all of a sudden the administration is okay with selling NVIDIA chips to Beijing, where we seem to have a changing cast of the advisors around President Trump, and we have a transactional president, and a moment when that might be possible. So I think this is, to me, the central challenge is like figuring out what might he actually go for, right? And what might what might President Trump actually sign off on? And then how might that shape the broader U.S.-China policy? Might we see a return to a much more commercially driven economic relationship rather than one where national security is the overwhelming force in the room? Might there be some kind of rupture between the White House and Congress over this? Might the Select Committee lose influence over China policy? Might someone like Jensen Huang be, in fact, the most important advisor to the president when it comes to China policy? And then we're also seeing, I think, and this gets into what Margaret was talking about, the kind of narrative about, the easy narrative about a G2 and this competition and so on. We're seeing a changing relationship in Europe. just what is happening with electric vehicles in Europe is fascinating, right? They have put up tariffs on the one hand against Chinese vehicles, and at the same time, they're welcoming, cautiously, but welcoming the building of Chinese EV factories in Europe. BYD is now looking at its third site in Europe, which is remarkable. And I remember sitting down with the Spanish economy minister last year at one point, and him pointing out that they had a former Peugeot plant I believe it was a Peugeot plant in Spain that had been bought by a Chinese EV company. And he said, what do I do? I get the whole point of putting up a barrier to EVs. I get that they might be, really tough competition for a European auto industry, but they're creating jobs in a place that needs jobs right now. And I think that is the kind of where the narrative is going to turn. And, we'll see what happens. We've seen Chinese investment in the US before. There's that famous documentary, American Factory, about Fuyao Glass. And some of us have probably I've been to that plant outside of Dayton, and it's still there. And we'll see what happens with places like that. But it's not a static relationship, right? The narrative isn't here, and it's not stuck. It's going to change, and it's going to evolve, and it might surprise us.
Thanks, Shawn.